Now, what about in traditional cultures? Well, if we compare all this to traditional cultures, a really important difference is that they're more likely to have really substantial gender differences in adolescent relationships with peers and family, as I've already mentioned in a previous class. Involvement with peers and friends tends to be much, much greater for boys than girls. So even in adolescence, adolescent girls spend much more time with same-sex adults than boys do. And for girls, their relationship with their parents, in particular their mother, remains very close. Not just in an emotional sense, but in terms of the amount of time they actually spend together. Adolescent girls in a traditional culture spend or have much more contact with their mom, their same-sex parent, but also with other female relatives like grandmothers, aunts, and other adult females than boys do with adult males. So that's the first difference. Another is that for both female and male adolescents in traditional cultures, more of their time is spent with their families. Now, part of the reason for this is because of something I've already mentioned, standardized education. That's the norm in our culture, but in many traditional cultures, schooling takes adolescents away from their families less. They tend not to have a standardized education system that puts them in daily contact with their peers for the better part of the year. But even in those traditional cultures where most adolescents do attend school, even if time with peers might increase because of this, they still spend more time with their family and to have a closer emotional bond with them than in the West. This is true in India. In this collectivistic culture, that is simply the norm. It's true in Brazil. It's true in Indonesia. So adolescents in non-Western societies usually maintain more of a closeness with family at the same time as they grow closer to their peers in adolescence. But here, as an adolescent grows closer to peers, it seems to be at the expense of maintaining a closeness with their family. Now, why do adolescents usually grow so much closer to their peers at this stage of life? Well, using the experience sampling method, remember that's where you get beeped throughout the day, studies show us that it is pretty common for adolescents to report that their happiest moments take place with friends, and they're generally much happier with friends than with family. And there's two main reasons for this. So again, the question is why? Well, two principal reasons have been proposed for this. One is that in a close friend, adolescents find somebody who mirrors their own emotions. And to me, this just makes sense. No matter what the particular situation is, a person is likely to feel close to somebody who's in the same kind of situation. If you're pregnant, if you're going through a divorce, if you're going through menopause, if you're raising a toddler, if you're trying to help aging parents, you're going to relate to somebody more if they're going through the same thing. This really reminds me of being in my 20s when people who were already married and having children simply had a lot more in common. They had a lot more to talk about with each other than they did with those who were not married or living with anybody and who were not parents. So being married and having kids compared to still being single without children can create a real divide. And as further evidence of this, your text cites a study in which it was noted for adolescents there was a really significant difference in their mood depending on if they were with their friends or with their family. When they were with their friends, their mood was more often positive, and with their parents, it was more often negative. As the parent of a teenage boy, I'll try not to be insulted by that. Now, the same study points out that there's also a difference in moods between the parent and their adolescent as well. The parent enjoys their time with their adolescent when the adolescent feels more negative about it. And maybe you can relate to this, thinking, why do I have to go to my grandparents' house? Do I have to stay for the family get-together? I have clear memories of feeling this way, that, I don't want to do that family stuff. I want to do my own thing. Now, a second reason that adolescents enjoy their time with their friends more than with their parents is that they can feel free and open with their friends in a way they rarely do with parents. Why? There's probably several reasons for this. I would think that part of it is simply because of the nature of the parenting relationship. The nature of that relationship is to guide them, to monitor them, to supervise, sometimes to implement consequences and make the adolescent do things they don't want to do. It's the nature of the parent-child relationship that the parent always has the upper hand, that one person has more control. And this prohibits their child from being as free and open with them as they are with their friends. So this might mean more than not letting parents know about things you do that you know they would disapprove of. It can include being able to talk to each other about how they truly feel about anything. A job, a romantic relationship, a sexual relationship, somebody you like, somebody you don't like. It might mean being able to use whatever kind of language you want to because you can be more unrestrained with your friends. In part because you're both at the same stage of life, you've been raised in the same generation and with the same generational experiences. So you're likely to have a lot of the same perspectives and worries and concerns. And a young person simply does not have that with their parents. This is what a generation gap is. A difference of opinions between one generation and another regarding beliefs, politics, or values. So being raised with social media compared to not being raised with it is a great example of a huge generational difference. Those two generations do not experience the world in the same way, and especially do not experience adolescence and the teenage years in the same way. They just don't. They don't experience being a teenager or high school or peer relationships or dating or social pressure in the same manner. Now, sometimes for young people, this ability to be open and free with friends in a way they can't with their parents, or in a way they feel they can't with their parents, yeah, it means getting a little crazy with friends, goofing off, being foolish, irresponsible, being silly with them because you can. And if part of the parental role is to supervise you and guide you, you could argue to essentially control you, being irresponsible and foolish is not going to be as easy with parents there. In their study, Larson and Richards specifically describe what they referred to as an escalating dynamic of manic joy, which they would sometimes capture in beeped moments using the experience sampling method. So using the experience sampling method, participants would be beeped and provide feedback at regular intervals. And what they found was that adolescents would feed off each other's energy. When they were around each other, they would get each other more and more worked up. They would get each other hyped up so that when they were with their friends, they would have a higher level of fun, and that level of fun could increase quite a bit. And it actually makes me feel kind of nostalgic for being a teenager again. I'm not sure I would go back and do it all again if I could, like in some Disney movie, but I absolutely do miss being totally carefree with friends and just being silly because I can. Now, you can still have friends when you're older, but you also have to arrange for childcare or put the dogs out when you get home, or maybe get up with your kids early the next morning. You still have to be responsible to some degree. Now, in one specific episode, Larson and Richards cite a group of boys were hanging around in one of their backyards when they started spraying each other with a hose, bugging each other, laughing, getting more and more excited. In another example, they cite adolescent girls at a sleepover were dancing on the pool table, laughing and hugging each other. Now, the pool table example to me is also a perfect example of how adolescents are not able to let loose with their parents in the same way they can with friends. Because if parents were there, you could be pretty sure they would have yelled at them for potentially breaking the pool table. The researchers noted, not surprisingly, that this shared enjoyment among these adolescents was especially high on weekends, which they called the emotional high point of the week for adolescents. Now, when I first read this, I have to be honest, I kind of laughed at how official and academic this sounds. What it just confirms what all of us already knew and would already expect, that Friday and Saturday nights typically become the highlight of the week for adolescents. We didn't need academic research to tell us this. But it's not all sunshine and lollipops for young people either, is it? Because friendships can be really difficult to navigate during adolescence. They can cause a lot of real stress. They can really cause a lot of emotional turmoil. And I personally think that social media has made this a lot more difficult. So using these experience sampling method studies, they have also confirmed that friends are the source of an adolescent's most negative emotions, whether it's anxiety or being angry or frustrated. Now, you could argue this is true of any relationship you have with anybody at any age, that when you're close to somebody and you rely on them and they matter to you, what this essentially does is leave you open to potentially being hurt by them. If you count on them for support and they become unsupportive in some way, if you rely on them for guidance and they become unavailable. So when you rely on somebody, it means that you're vulnerable to maybe being hurt by them because you develop a dependence on them. In these experience sampling method studies, it was clear that adolescents worry a lot about whether their friends like them and whether they're popular enough. This is a big source of stress and one I personally remember very well. In my day, in the later 1980s, because I graduated from grade 12 in 1989, teens would very commonly spend hours and hours talking on the phone with friends about what somebody said, how they said it, their exact wording, their tone of voice, the look on their face when they said it, why they said it, what they think it means, what it might possibly mean, and so on and so on. And I'm guessing that these days adolescents would also hyper-analyze Facebook statuses with that ever important relationship status. They would pore over a text conversation, an instant message, Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, and all the rest. And since misunderstanding is much more of a likelihood with electronic communication, there's more likely to be stress and emotional upheaval because of a misunderstanding. So coming back to Larson and Richards, they observed that, quote, triangles, misunderstandings, and conflicting alliances were a regular part of the social lives of the adolescents we studied, end quote. Now, being past this stage, you can look at the examples in the text and think about how silly it was. What a waste of energy it was to be so hyper concerned with all of it, and it didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But at the time, it's not silly at all, is it? It's serious to you. You took it seriously. It's important. It was what was going on with your life at that point. And because at that stage of life, your friends are so much more important to you, you naturally focus on your relationships with them more. So if something's not right with a friend, whether it's some kind of little tiff or a big disagreement, or not even an actual disagreement, you just thought there was a chance of a disagreement, you focused on it more and it bothered you more. So when we look at how, oh yeah, sorry, on the slide here I said, remember that imaginary audience, that you think everybody's paying more attention to you than they really are, which makes this even more intense. So we know from our own experiences that friends typically become much more important in adolescence than they have before adolescence. And research confirms this. And this is pretty standard. But why? Why does this shift regarding the importance of friends not occur in childhood? And why doesn't it hold off until emerging adulthood? What is it about adolescence that makes friends increasingly important? Well, probably the most distinctive feature of adolescent friendships compared with friendships in childhood is, again, intimacy. So two people having a close emotional bond. They're sharing their thoughts and their feelings. It's this close feeling with somebody. And compared to friendships in childhood, friendships in adolescence have a level of intimacy that children simply do not. In adolescence, friends talk about their thoughts and feelings with each other much, much more than in childhood. And I mean this to be a little humorous, but I'm also using it as a real example. How often do you hear friends in grade 2 talking about how frustrated they are, or that something's really bothering them. In adolescence, this changes. People tend to confide in their friends about what is bothering them more, about how they feel. And when they do this, when anybody does this and talks with others about how they feel, it allows them to vent, to let off steam. So in some ways, it helps them to work things out. It helps them understand what's bothering them, whether it's difficulties with their parents or with teachers or a love interest or other friends, or maybe even with themselves. There really is a benefit to it. And young people do this in adolescence to a far greater degree than they do in childhood. Now, ideas about how important intimacy is in friendship and how that increases in importance during adolescence, that actually goes back quite a bit. It goes back to the 1950s and a researcher named Harry Stack Sullivan. And he recognized that this increases in early adolescence. And he said that this is because at this point, cognitively speaking, people have developed enough that they're now able to take on the perspective of others. They're able to experience empathy in a way that they simply weren't able to do as children. So they're able to take on two different perspectives. And this is actually another example of how your cognitive development affects other kinds of development during adolescence. It's because of their cognitive development, because it's advanced to this level, that it enables them to have these more advanced skills for perspective taking, more advanced skills for putting themselves in the position of others and being empathetic. So it allows them to develop friendships with intimacy instead of just viewing their friends as somebody they hang out with or do things with. And then in turn again, like a game of dominoes, with each piece affecting the next piece, having this new capacity for deeper friendship is then going to encourage them to develop further perspective taking. So talking with friends might influence you in several ways. It might present you new perspectives on religion, drinking underage, what dating should be like. It may provide you different perspectives on premarital sex, developing more of an interest in something or losing interest in something, or how you get along with your parents, or what is or is not appropriate or attractive regarding appearance. Anything you can think of. It's because of the emotional attachment, the intimacy that develops with your friends at this age, this mutual attachment that you have with each other as friends, that a young person is open to seeing things from that other person's point of view, to take on a different perspective. If they didn't have this attachment to their friends, they couldn't be bothered putting in the effort to see things from their friend's point of view. And this has a further effect because, in a sense, it encourages young people to think about themselves. It helps them think about their own perspectives, their own opinions. It helps them to gauge who they themselves are. So this kind of friendship helps them figure out how they screwed up a romantic relationship, or they are going to tell you that you were a jerk with somebody, or that you said something you shouldn't have, or help you realize what you should expect from others in terms of how they treat you. So they're going to prop you up with compliments, tell you did something well, that you look good because of that sense of intimacy you have with each other. But they're also going to be more honest with you when you're in the wrong. Now, in a very unacademic sense, we could look at this and say, yep, that's what friends do. But in an academic sense, we can say that what your friends are doing is contributing to your identity formation. All of this, these intimate friendships, help adolescents more accurately assess their own abilities and their own personality and develop their own independent identity. So adolescents are more likely than children to disclose personal information to their friends, to say, yeah, my friends are the ones that help me work through my crap, to view their friends as people who provide them with support. You know, my friends are the ones that have my back. And this all has to do with that concept of intimacy, that close emotional bond. Now, I want to highlight two studies that show the development of intimacy in adolescent friendships from the textbook. One looks at differences between late childhood and early adolescence, and another examines differences from early adolescence to emerging adulthood. So in the first study by Diaz and Berndt, they look at pairs of best friends in late childhood, which is about fourth grade, and eighth grade when people are in the early stages of adolescence. So late childhood, early adolescence. And in their study, these pairs of best friends were asked to provide information of each other. So how well do you know your best friend in fourth grade and eighth grade? So if you think about fourth grade, that really is when childhood is winding down, isn't it? It's late childhood. And you think of eighth grade, that's right before high school. In this study, the best friends were asked to provide information about the other's backgrounds. When is their birth date? What's their telephone number? Really basic information about each other. And they were asked basic questions about their preferences. So what does Jennifer like on her pizza? What's her favorite ice cream? What's her favorite subject in school? What subject does she hate the most in school? And they were asked questions about their best friend's thoughts and feelings. So what do they worry about? What makes them angry? What makes them happy? So these are not terribly complicated questions. And this is the difference. This is why this is important. So in both fourth grade and eighth grade, the best friends knew lots of the basics about each other. But in eighth grade, they knew a lot more about each other's thoughts and feelings. They had information about their best friend that was much more personal, much more intimate in nature. So in other words, as they entered adolescence, their friendships became deeper. There's more of an emotional bond with your friends in adolescence compared to childhood. In the second study, it looked at early adolescence, which is about grade 7 or 8, like we just talked about, and it looked at the end of adolescence into emerging adulthood. And this study took a bit different approach. They asked people to describe a time when they felt especially close to a friend. The older group at the end of adolescence into emerging adulthood provided descriptions that included a lot more self-disclosure. So to kind of put this in everyday people speak instead of academic terms, in early adolescence in grades 7 and 8, and describing a time when a friend was there for them or describing their friendship, it was more activity-based. At the end of adolescence into emerging adulthood, there was a lot more intimacy, a lot more description of thoughts and feelings. They focused more on the emotions associated with their description and their emotional bond. So summarizing all of this, what this means is at each stage of life, what it means to be a friend shifts. It changes. Friendship itself changes. Now, there's also been differences in gender noted in the composition of friendships in adolescence. There's pretty consistent gender differences in adolescent friendship. Girls tend to have more intimacy in their friendships than boys. They tend to have more of an emotional bond. So, for example, girls put a lot more emphasis on how important it is to just talk with each other as a major part of their friendship. To them, that's much more important. They feel it's much more important to be nurturing with each other. Boys have close friends, but they're more likely to base their friendships on what they do with each other. Now, this doesn't mean that boys don't have an emotional element in their friendships, but it's very different than with girls. So how do you even choose who you're going to be friends with? I mean, think of all the people you've gone to school with from kindergarten onward. Why were you friends with some and only peers with others? So generally speaking, what determines who will become your close friends? I've already alluded to the fact that your parents will have a direct effect simply by determining where you live, which will affect who you have around you and where you go to school. So your parents are going to affect who your pool of friends to choose from are. But other than that, though, the key word in determining who an adolescent becomes friends with is similarity. An adolescent tends to make friends with people who are similar to them in age, gender, and other characteristics. This is called selective association. We select who we associate to. The principle that most people tend to choose friends who are similar to themselves. And they're most likely to choose friends who are similar to themselves regarding 4 criteria. For example, education. And this can mean several things. It could mean their general attitude towards school. So somebody who is academically oriented, who really is concerned about getting good marks, is not likely to be good friends with somebody who skips school a lot and couldn't care less what marks they get and doesn't hand in their homework on time and really studies. Even in emerging adulthood, somebody who is attending university and then graduate school, who studies a lot and considers school really important, is not likely to be good friends with somebody whose attitude is the opposite. If you think of the college and university setting, there are often groups of friends who study a lot together and seem serious about getting a good education, and other groups of friends who party a lot together and seem intent on having a good time. That's their main concern. So in both adolescence and emerging adulthood, your friends tend to be similar to you in terms of attitude towards education. That's a key criteria.